The sun was high, the air was crisp. It was one of those perfect days that made you feel alive, where the world seemed to be painted in the most vibrant colours. The sky was a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds, and the forest was a lush green, teeming with life. Daniel, laden with his backpack and hiking stick, felt invigorated. Each step he took seemed to breathe new energy into his body. The weight of his backpack was a comforting reminder of the essentials he carried, tools for survival and exploration. He loved these solo treks into the heart of nature. It was his way of escaping the hustle and bustle of everyday life, a chance to reconnect with the world in its purest form. The solitude was not loneliness, but a cherished companion. Today's adventure, an unmarked trail through a forest he'd never explored. The thrill of the unknown beckoned him forward, each twist and turn of the path a new discovery waiting to be made. He felt like an explorer charting new territories. The path was clear, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Birdsong filled the air. The melodies of the forest creatures created a symphony that was both calming and invigorating. It was as if the forest itself was welcoming him. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, whispering secrets he couldn't quite catch. The rustling leaves seemed to be in conversation, sharing stories of the forest's ancient past. It was a language he longed to understand. He smiled. This was his happy place. Here, amidst the trees and the wildlife, he found a sense of peace that eluded him in the city. His worries seemed to fade away, replaced by a profound sense of contentment. He walked for hours, energized by the beauty around him. The forest was a living, breathing entity, and he felt a deep connection to it. Every step was a new experience, every sight a new wonder. He stopped for a quick water break, enjoying the solitude. The cool water was refreshing, a brief respite before he continued his journey. He took a moment to appreciate the silence, the only sounds being the gentle rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. A lone hawk circled above, its piercing cry echoing through the woods. The sight of the majestic bird filled him with awe. It was a reminder of the wild, untamed beauty of nature, a symbol of freedom and strength. Time seemed to melt away. He felt free. In this place he was not bound by the constraints of time or responsibility. He was simply a part of the natural world, free to explore and discover at his own pace. This was where he truly belonged. The main path was clear, well-trodden, easy. But something drew him to a smaller, almost hidden path branching off to the right. He hesitated. Curiosity piqued. He decided to explore. This path was narrower, swallowed by the encroaching woods. The trees here were larger, older. Their branches, heavy with moss, seemed to reach out like grasping claws. He felt a prickle of unease, but he pressed on. The sunlight, once bright and playful, was now anemic, struggling to penetrate the thickening canopy. The air grew heavy, the earlier playful breeze replaced by an oppressive stillness. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. He should turn back. He continued, telling himself he could turn back any minute. He just wanted to see where this path led. The forest floor was now a tangled mess of roots and fallen branches, making each step a conscious effort. He noticed the shadows. They seemed to writhe, twisting and contorting in ways that defied the sun's position. He paused, heart quickening, his breath catching in his throat. Something wasn't right. He shook his head, willing himself to be logical. It was just the light playing tricks on him. He would turn back soon. He just needed to see a little more. The silence struck him then. It was as if the entire forest had taken a collective breath and decided to hold it. The usual symphony of nature, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, the hum of insects, all had ceased. The bird-song had vanished, replaced by an unnerving quiet. It was a silence so profound that it seemed to press against his eardrums, making him acutely aware of the absence of life around him. The forest, once a vibrant tapestry of sounds, now felt like a lifeless painting. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the forest eerily still. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The trees, tall and imposing, stood like silent sentinels, their branches unmoving. It was as if the forest itself was watching him, waiting. He strained his ears, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. Not a rustle, not a chirp, not even the distant murmur of a stream. The silence was absolute, and it was starting to gnaw at his nerves. Only the sound of his own breath, ragged and loud in the oppressive silence. Each inhale and exhale seemed amplified, echoing in the void around him. His heartbeat, too, was a relentless drum in his ears, a reminder of his growing anxiety. His hand went to his pocket, checking for his phone, needing to hear something familiar. The touch of the device was a small comfort, a link to the world outside this unnerving stillness. He pulled out his phone, the screen a bright rectangle in the dim light. The glow was almost blinding in the shadowy forest, a stark contrast to the natural darkness that surrounded him. No signal, of course. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was truly alone, cut off from any form of communication. The forest had swallowed him whole, and there was no way to call for help. He shoved the phone back, a knot of fear forming in his stomach. The device, once a symbol of connection and safety, was now just a useless piece of metal and glass. His mind raced, thoughts of what could be lurking in the silence filling his head. This had been a mistake. He should have never ventured this deep into the forest alone. The sense of adventure that had driven him here now felt like foolishness. He was in over his head, and he knew it. He needed to get back to the main path, now. Panic was setting in, and he knew he had to keep it at bay. The forest was a maze, and he had to find his way out before the silence consumed him completely. He turned, retracing his steps, panic rising. The path, however, seemed to stretch endlessly, the familiar markers he'd noted on his way in now absent. Disorientation washed over him. He was lost, and then he felt it. A prickling sensation at the back of his neck, like he was being watched. He whirled around, scanning the trees, his heart pounding in his chest. There was nothing. He tried to rationalize it away. Nerves, he was lost, tired. His imagination was running wild. But deep down a primal fear took root. He wasn't alone. He was certain of it now. Panic seized him. He had to get out of there. He broke into a run, branches whipping at his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. He could feel it behind him, silent and swift, closing the distance. The feeling of being hunted, of being prey, spurred him on. He tripped, falling heavily, scraping his hands on the rough ground. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain, and ran. He had to get out, had to escape the oppressive presence that stalked him. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed for mercy. He stumbled to a halt, leaning against a tree, his body trembling with exhaustion. He dared to look back. The path was empty. He was alone, but the feeling of dread remained, a cold hand squeezing his heart. He was still being watched. He could feel it in every fibre of his being. There was no escape. He pushed himself away from the tree, staggering forward. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to keep moving. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let it catch him. His body screamed in protest, every muscle aching with fatigue. It was impossible. He was fit, used to long hikes, yet he felt like he hadn't slept in days, his limbs heavy, his mind sluggish. He realized with growing horror that he was moving slower, each step an immense effort. The forest seemed to press in, the air growing thick and cloying, stealing his breath. He stumbled again, falling to his knees. He tried to rise, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. He was so tired, he just needed to rest for a moment, just a moment. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the overwhelming fatigue. The weight of the journey had finally caught up with him, each step heavier than the last. His body ached, muscles screaming for respite. The forest, once a place of adventure, now felt like a never-ending maze, each tree a silent sentinel to his struggle. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when he felt it again. A strange sensation, like a whisper in the dark, pulling him from the depths of his exhaustion. His mind, foggy and disoriented, struggled to grasp the reality around him. Was it minutes? Hours? Time seemed to blur in this endless woodland. The prickling sensation, closer now, sending a jolt of terror through him. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in the silence. Fear gripped him, cold and unrelenting, as he realized he was not alone. He forced his eyes open. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, pressing in from all sides. His breath came in shallow gasps, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. He strained his ears, listening for any sound, any sign of life. The forest was dark, the last vestiges of daylight swallowed by the dense canopy. Shadows danced around him, playing tricks on his weary mind. Every rustle, every creak of a branch seemed amplified in the stillness. The path ahead was barely visible, a narrow ribbon of hope in the encroaching gloom. He was still on the path. The realization brought a fleeting sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the growing dread. The path, once a guide, now felt like a trap, leading him deeper into the unknown. Had he moved at all? The forest seemed unchanged, as if mocking his efforts. He turned in circles, trying to find any landmark, any sign that he had made progress, but it was all the same. An endless sea of trees and shadows. He tried to call out, but his voice was a dry croak. Panic surged through him as he realized how alone he truly was. His throat burned, parched from the hours of wandering. He swallowed hard, trying to muster the strength to shout again. He looked up, his blood turning to ice. The canopy above seemed to close in, a dark, oppressive ceiling. His eyes darted around, searching for the source of his fear. The silence was deafening, broken only by the pounding of his heart. 2 points of light, like malevolent eyes, stared at him from the darkness, their gaze filled with an ancient, hungry intelligence. He was not alone. The realization hit him like a physical blow, the weight of it almost too much to bear. Those eyes, unblinking and relentless, seemed to pierce his very soul, and the path never ended. It stretched out before him, an unbroken line into the abyss. Each step forward felt like a step deeper into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The forest, the path, the eyes, they were all part of a relentless, unending journey.